In Magnus Carlsen's 5th game in the European Club Cup, he faced another strong player. Yesterday he was black against Shakhriyar Mamedyarov and drew pretty comfortably. Today he had white against Ding Liren, who's on an extraordinary run at the moment. He hasn't lost for something like 89 or 90 games. I'm not quite sure of the exact stat. He's doing very well. He's rated well over 2,800 now, so a severe test for Magnus Carlsen. Well, that's what he wants just before the World Championship match, get himself in gear. So it was a pretty steady, solid start for both players. Carlsen has played this 4 knights variation of the Scotch, and this has a very tedious reputation going back well over 100 years. All really well known. I mean, recently Carlsen actually had this exact variation against Adiban in Vaikonzai in last January. So this is the approved method of playing for black. I mean, basically, white's problem is that as black has central control with c6 and d5, it's really hard for white to get anywhere in this position. I mean, just because of that centre, black is absolutely fine. The game against Adiban, so Adiban against Carlsen, went rook a e1 in this position. And somehow Magnus, from a roughly level position, managed to squeeze a win. Today, Carlsen with white played h3, and after h6, he wasn't tempted to go in for the endgame. Basically, after this exchange, white has 0 advantage. Black's 2 bishops easily balance the rect structure on the king side, and bishops and centre. Black is absolutely fine. But Carlsen's idea was just to come back with bishop f4. So typical Carlsen, he's not played an opening where he's trying to blow his opponent out of the water. He's just trying to basically get the ball over the net and get into a rally. He's not looking for a winner from the opening. So this is very much against the kind of style that Kasparov always used to use. You know, Kasparov was striving for the advantage in the opening, but it's not Magnus's way. Just wants to get the ball over the net. So these moves look pretty standard. Rook b4 starts to generate a little bit of initiative for black. I mean, Ding has a really comfortable position. You know, I like the centre. Of course, Magnus's development is quite harmonious. I mean, it's just a balanced position. Here, black could play bishop e6, bishop d7. Ding goes for a5. Could be useful if the knight ever moves away. Could play a4 with a little bit of initiative. Rook d1 from Carlsen. Pieces in the middle. Can't be bad. Now bishop queen e3. So now things start to happen. So this queen could be looking down here, or maybe e5, also looking down at a7. Little tactic, d4 doesn't actually win material because the queen steps out of the way. And of course, pawn takes can be met by a discovered attack on the queen. That's a check, of course. And d4, if d4 doesn't win material, then obviously it creates weaknesses here. c4, so not good, and blocks out the rook. So anyway, rook c8 played. Well, we'll see the point of that move in a second, actually. Queen a7. So Carlsen's starting to generate a bit of play. And rook h4. Okay, things are beginning to warm up. So Ding is a fierce attacker. And if the queen is moving left, well, the rook is moving right. And looking at white's king. So bishop h3 is in the air in this position. Therefore, rook e3 from Carlsen, defending the h-pawn. Now, once again, d4 doesn't actually win material because of knight e4. And after this exchange, well, I think Carlsen would be happy with that position. Once again, the pawn has advanced prematurely. So after this little attacking demonstration with rook h4, Ding just drop the queen back. So now we see the point of rook c8. He'd actually anticipated this queen a7 move. So the queen covers the pawn and offers a trade. So Carlsen exchanged queens and played the knight to a4, which looks pretty normal again, looking at the squares. Of course, if the knight could sink itself on c5, then white could start to think about some advantage here. But no, of course, c5 is the normal response to that. And here is an extraordinary moment in the game, and I honestly find it very hard to imagine what Magnus was thinking about when he played this next move. To me, it's so atypical, or it's untypical of Magnus, his next move. With the bishop looking at the knight, it seems normal to play the knight into b6. Now perhaps he was a little bit concerned that that knight could find itself trapped, but actually after, well, c3 is possible, but I think c4 is not bad. And this position is still, there's still some life in it actually. There's still some play here, because this knight is not trapped. After rook b7, the knight actually comes to c8 and looks at these squares, and actually white is fine here. With this rook, let's just come back to this position. Of course, black is not obliged to allow the knight into c8. With the rook on h4, you know, sometimes that rook could be a little offside. So this doesn't seem like a bad way for white to play at all. But instead, Carlsen played the move g4, and I find that, as I said, it's an extraordinary move and really so untypical of Magnus actually. Now, if the rook is going to be trapped here, all well and good, but Ding finds a very obvious way to upset white, and that's d4. So obviously if the rook moves up the e file somewhere, then the h pawn is on prise. So the rook has to keep hold of the pawn, and Magnus played rook f3. Rook g3 could be met either by rook takes pawn, let's just have a quick look at that, and bishop takes g4. I mean, that's actually possible in the game as well, actually. Or another move, h5 to break up those pawns. And if g5, knight d5 comes in here, and well, white's structure looks a mess. So, but instead of rook g3, rook f3 played. And as I said, rook takes h3 is possible here. That's one way of playing the position. But Ding selected another way. He played knight g4. So it just shows you, you know, there are two tactical refutations of this move. And refutation is a strong word, but two ways that black can play tactically and actually get the advantage. So what happens if the knight is taken? Now, this did not happen. Bishop c6. This is unfortunate. If the rook moves, then rook h1 is mate. If bishop e2, then rook e7 puts pressure on the bishop. Now, I mean, white is in a terrible bind here. I dare say there's more than one way to do this, but here's one possible continuation. And now rook e1, you can see there's still a pin here. The rook is active, that bishop is loose, so the knight has to come back. And now just f6 to let the king into the game. And if the king comes up, well, if the king goes to f4, the king is actually going to run into a mating net after g5, and I mean, this could be completely disastrous. And there are some pretty nasty things going on here. Let's go back. So king h2 is possible, but then we take here, and well, it's a winning endgame. I mean, this is there are other ways to go here as well, but I mean, that's quite a forcing way to play for black. So I think taking this knight looks terrible. So Magnus played rook e1. So basically he's just a pawn down now, and his king side really doesn't look good. So this is a serious problem for the world champion. And black's piece is looking great. And now that rook, which was offside, well, when there's no g-pawn, then it looks in a pretty strong position. g5 just fixes those weaknesses, fixes these squares, and gives the king a nice square on g7 as well. Now, if black wanted to play perhaps more conservatively, then you could drop the bishop, so that protects this, and then move the knight into f4. That's another way of playing with really strong initiative. But Ding went for knight h5 straight away. And now it starts getting really tricky. Bishop f5. So of course, if the rook is taken, then black's rook is trapped. So the rook moves out. So now that is a threat. So rook g4. So an exchange of rooks. The knight comes to a beautiful square. Knight d7. I mean, this is still a very, very tricky position. You can see pieces kind of scattered all over the place, but Ding is still a pawn up, and white's king is not great. And here he exploited that fact that white's king is actually lacks cover here. He wants to get his rook into the attack through here. Maybe the d pawn is coming too, so that really has to be taken. Rook takes. So Carlsen gets one pawn back, but now the rook enters the position. Well, Carlsen couldn't prevent this, of course. And the rook comes down. So it's getting very close to a mating net. So for example, if a4, that terrible mistake, then knight e2, all those squares are guarded, and rook h1 coming. So knight e5 played by Carlsen. A check. And the bishop came back to d5. So pawns are level at the moment. But rook g1 check threatened. So that's why f3 has to be played. And now, I mean, there are various ways that black can play this. You could advance the h-pawn. You can play rook f1. Ding chose rook e1, attacking the knight on e5. And when the knight came back, then he switched back. He drove the knight away because he wants to get to the f3 pawn, basically. Here Carlsen made a mistake. He would have had more chances to defend with king h2. Now, this looks absolutely terrible. It looks as though white's king is, well, it is literally cornered. But incredibly, there is a way out for white, and that's knight e1. Attacking both of these. And then another amazing move, d3. I mean, of course, this is a computer variation. Very hard for the players to foresee this. So if that's taken with a pawn, then that's quite a nice discovered check. Rook takes rook. So knight f3. I mean, another kind of very cool, amazing move. So if the knight moves, then the pawn is going through. So that pawn has to be taken. Now, what's going on in this position? This was definitely better than the game continuation. Seems to me that black still has some advantage here. But this is definitely white's best chance of defending. So that's a mad variation after king h2, but Carlsen played king f2. So the king goes to the back rank. Never pleasant. And bishop c4, good move. Perhaps rook takes c2 coming, and then there's a nasty pin. So the king stepped out of the way. A check. Puts the king in the corner. And the move that Ding played now is good, but maybe there was better. I mean, it's very hard to judge these kind of endgames. But after rook takes c2, then knight takes knight. Okay, there's a threat here, so the rook has to give a check. And then pawn takes. This is, I mean, obviously better for black. This is a dangerous passed pawn. Black is actually a pawn up. The rook is going to have to go behind that pawn. And the king can come up to defend. I mean, black has pretty good winning chances, I would say. I think this pawn is probably going to drop very soon. And then the king, well, might be consigned to the back rank. I think excellent winning chances for black. Instead of taking on c2, Ding played bishop takes knight, which also looks very promising. After this, you can hardly blame him for wanting to keep that beautiful knight on f4. And the rook is coming in to take some pawns. h4 from Magnus. Excellent defensive move. So, yeah, pawn takes pawn. That just makes life a bit harder for black to make progress. So rook h3, and Ding takes the h-pawn with the rook. But of course that sidelines the rook just for a moment. And that gives white chances. Bishop f1 from Carlsen. Looks horrible. Looks incredibly passive. But actually the bishop does a good job of protecting the king. And having removed the bishop also prevents a lost rook and pawn endgame, of course. And the bishop can be very useful, as we'll see in a second, supporting that a pawn. Now here, there's maybe Ding's last chance was to play rook f4. He played d3 here. This is incredibly complicated, but maybe rook f4 was a better chance. But anyway, he played d3. And here's the point. He wants this. This would give black good winning chances once that knight sits on f4. But Carlsen was able to play a5. And this is an important variation. If d2, then the rook comes behind that pawn. And after rook a4, a6, very important that that bishop has been retained, holding the pawn, and then white can take this off and white is okay. So in the game, pawn takes pawn was played. Now, black is still a pawn up here, but it's hard to make progress when that pawn is on a6. So, well, the game ended like this. h5, rook here, attacking this one, king came up, and they agreed to draw. Basically, they repeated the position. If we just go back here, if king f5, then black can even lose if he's careless after this rook exchange, and pawn goes through. Coming back to this position, so this is where Ding played d3. Let me try and explain why rook f4 might have given black a chance. So king f2 defends the f-pawn, and now d3. So it's still possible to take this. And then, I mean, we can't say that this is a winning position for black, but black has chances. Okay, so why can't Carlsen play as in the game with a5? Let's take a look. d2. And when the rook comes here to stop the pawn, black plays rook f5. That's the amazing move. And of course, it's a computer move. So rook takes rook, queen. And if rook takes pawn, then rook takes pawn. And we're back in this endgame, which, as I said, is not a definite win, but certainly gives black chances once that knight lands on f4. Now that, I'm certainly not criticising Ding. I mean, that is an unbelievably difficult variation to foresee, let alone understand. I mean, it took me a long time to appreciate exactly why the computer was wanting to include these moves before playing d3, but okay, I think we got there. So that's the final position. Carlsen managed to draw, but he came so close, so close. I'm sure he'll be feeling enormous relief after that game. He's still 3.5 rating points ahead of Fabiano Caruana on the live list. But he came close to handing over the top spot today. Do check out the Carlsen playlist up there and the other games from the European Club Cup as well. And of course the Fabiano Caruana playlist and the Ding Liren playlist as well. They're all up there. And if you're not a subscriber, then do click the button and click the bell for instant notifications. Thanks for watching.